Hello, beloved, and thank you for tuning in to Bible Bits with me, Pastor Will. Each week, we're going to take a few minutes to explore a major story or theme in the scriptures and try to break it down to understand a bit of what it says about God, what it means for you and me, and how it relates to the whole story of scripture. Now, last week, we talked about some of the stories around Abraham and Sarah. We learned about God's promise to give Abraham land, children, and to make him a blessing to every nation. We also learned that for Abraham, righteousness looks like belief, and that human beings are made to trust God. Finally, we were reminded that the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace their origins back to Abraham. For Judaism and Christianity, we see it follow through Sarah's son Isaac, and for Islam through Hagar's son Ishmael. Today, we're going to move very quickly through the rest of the book of Genesis and see how God's promise to Abraham continued through his descendants, through Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. It's a lot of ground to cover, but for those who want to dig a little bit deeper, we're going to be skimming through Genesis 25 to 50. So let's get started. When we left off, Abraham had died, and his two eldest sons, Ishmael and Isaac, came together to bury him. And in the middle of Genesis 25, we have Isaac praying to the Lord that Rebekah might bear children, and she conceives twins. The babies struggle within her, and the Lord reveals that the struggles in her womb will be continued after they're born. That these children will be the fathers of two great nations. The firstborn is covered with hair, so they name him Esau, which means hairy. And the second twin is born clutching Esau's heel, so they name him Jacob, which means heel or supplanter. The twins grow up very different. Esau favors the outdoors and becomes a skillful hunter, and Jacob is said to be a quiet man who prefers to live in the tents. And we're told that Isaac loves Esau more, but Rebekah favors Jacob. Now, it's important to recognize that the cultural norm of this time was that the eldest son received the lion's share of the inheritance, even if the eldest was only older by a few minutes. So in this case, the birthright belongs to Esau because he was born before Jacob. But at the end of Genesis 25, we're told that one day when Esau had been out hunting, he returned absolutely famished, and Jacob was making some lentil stew. And Esau says to him, "Please give me some of that stew. I'm famished. I'm about to die." And Jacob says, "You can have the stew, but first you have to give me your birthright." And Esau agrees. He must have been powerfully hungry because he says, "I'm about to die. What use is a birthright to me?" And so Jacob manages to obtain his brother's share of the inheritance for a bowl of stew. And then in Genesis 27, Isaac is close to death and he's lost his sight. Now, the birthright had been sold to Jacob, but Isaac still had a blessing to offer his firstborn and favorite son. So he tells Esau to go out into the field and hunt some game to fix his favorite dish so that he can bless Esau. But as soon as Esau leaves, Rebekah calls her favorite son Jacob and starts to plot with him. She sends Jacob to get 2 young goats, which she will prepare just the way her husband likes them. And then Jacob can take the food in and receive the blessing Isaac intends for his brother. Rebekah dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes and puts the skins of the goats on his arms so that he'll feel hairier, and Isaac won't know that it's smooth-skinned Jacob. And so by deceit, Jacob steals his father's blessing as well. And when Esau finds out what has happened, he's furious, and he vows to kill Jacob as soon as their father has died. So Rebekah sends Jacob away to live with her brother Laban in Haran. Now, as Jacob leaves, he stops for the night in a certain place and falls asleep. And while he's asleep, Jacob dreams of a ladder going up into heaven and angels going up and down. And the Lord comes to him and makes the same promises that God had made to Abraham. He will have land, he will have countless offspring, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through him. When Jacob wakes up, he promises that if God will be with him and protect him on his journey and bring him back to this spot, then he will indeed worship the Lord. So Jacob continues his journey, and when he gets to Haran, he meets his uncle Laban and Laban's two daughters, Leah and Rachel. And Jacob falls in love with Rachel. And he serves Laban for 7 years for the right to marry Rachel. But when the day comes, Laban gives his older daughter, Leah, to Jacob instead. He says it's not right to let the younger marry before the older. And so Jacob spends another 7 years serving Laban so that he can also marry Rachel. And then Jacob begins having children. First, Leah has 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Then Rachel, who is jealous because she doesn't seem to be able to have children, gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob. And Bilhah bears Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah gives her maid Zilpah to Jacob, and Zilpah bears Gad and Asher. And then Leah has 2 more sons and a daughter, Issachar and Zebulun, and the daughter is Dinah. Finally, Rachel conceives, and she bears a son, Joseph. And Joseph will be his father's favorite because Joseph is the son of his favorite wife. Now, the time comes for Joseph to return, but not before cheating his uncle Laban out of the best of the herd and gaining considerable wealth for himself. Along the way, Jacob hears that Esau is coming to meet him, so he comes up with a plan. And in Genesis 32, we find Jacob dividing his wives and his children and his servants and his flocks and his possessions into groups and sending them ahead across the river to meet Esau. And each group, as they encounter Esau, is to present themselves as a gift from Jacob to Esau. Jacob figures that he can either buy his brother's forgiveness by sending all of these possessions ahead of him, or else if Esau is still so angry that he attacks the first group, then the groups behind can flee, and that includes his favorite wife and favorite child. He wants to protect the things dearest to his heart, but Jacob is last across the river. And as he camps by the riverside, a man wrestles with him. And they wrestle all night. Neither one can get the upper hand, and by morning, this unknown assailant first puts Jacob's hip out of socket and then asks Jacob to let him go. And Jacob refuses until his attacker will bless him. The man responds by changing Jacob's name. No more is he going to be Jacob the heel. Now he will be Israel, the one who has wrestled with God. And after this encounter, in the next chapter, Jacob will meet his brother Esau, and the two will be reconciled. Now, there is a lot more to Jacob's story, but we want to have time to talk about Joseph too. But before we get to Joseph, it's worth noting that up to this point, Jacob really hasn't been much of a hero. He lies, he cheats, he steals, and ultimately he's proven to be something of a coward. Jacob's life is characterized by scheming, right up until he comes face to face with God and his life is turned around. And just as God changed Abraham's name, God changes Jacob's name, and it gives Jacob a new identity. It sets his life on a new path. And perhaps the same should be true for us. An encounter with God ought to be life-changing. It ought to turn us around. And we see in Jacob just how dramatic a change encountering God can bring about in our lives. But now let's skip ahead to Joseph. Ultimately, Jacob had 13 children, 12 sons and 1 daughter. His 12th son, Benjamin, was born to Rachel, but Rachel died in childbirth. And as we said, Joseph is by far his father's favorite, despite being the 11th son. And that fact seems to go to Joseph's head a bit. In Genesis 37, we learn that Joseph has these dreams. And he says that these dreams mean that his brothers will all bow to him. Even his parents will eventually bow to him. And his older brothers find Joseph absolutely insufferable. He also seems to have a habit of bringing back ill reports of his brother's work to his parents, and I'm sure that doesn't ingratiate him to his brothers. And so one day, when they're out working in the fields, the brothers decide to throw Joseph into a pit. And while they're having lunch and deciding whether or not to kill Joseph, a caravan of Ishmaelites comes by. So they decide to sell their brother into slavery. And then they tear up his robe a bit and take it back to their father Jacob, claiming that a wild animal has killed Joseph. Meanwhile, Joseph has been taken to Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph becomes a slave in the house of Potiphar, who is an official in Pharaoh's court. And we're told that God is with Joseph in everything he does. He causes everything Joseph touches to prosper. And it isn't long before Potiphar takes notice and gives Joseph responsibility over his whole household. But then Potiphar's wife takes notice of Joseph and tries to seduce him. Joseph refuses, but one day she grabs at his cloak and he runs away, leaving his clothes behind him. And Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to take advantage of her. So Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison, but God is still with Joseph. Before long, the chief jailer takes notice of Joseph and sets him in charge of the other prisoners. And God continues to prosper everything that Joseph does. In Genesis 40, 2 of the prisoners in Joseph's care, Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker, both have dreams. And now Joseph, the dreamer, interprets these dreams for them. He tells the cupbearer that in 3 days he will be restored to his post. And he tells the baker that in 3 days he will be hanged. Both of these things come to pass, and Joseph's only wish is that the cupbearer remember him when he's restored to Pharaoh's side. But the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. That is until Pharaoh begins to have dreams himself. 2 years later, in Genesis 41, Pharaoh has dreams that disturb him, but no one in his court is able to interpret the dreams. And then the cupbearer remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh about the prisoner who interpreted his dream. Pharaoh has Joseph brought up to him, and Joseph tells Pharaoh that his dreams reveal what God is about to do. There will be 7 years of excess, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that the smart thing to do is to put somebody wise and discerning in charge of storing up food and rationing so that nobody goes hungry during those 7 years of famine to come. And Pharaoh thinks that this is an excellent idea and decides that Joseph is just the guy for the job. So Joseph, who had been sold into slavery by his brothers, becomes second in command to Pharaoh, who is at this time the most powerful man in the world. And the rest of the book of Genesis details how Joseph's brothers will come to Egypt in search of food and eventually be reconciled with Joseph, but not before Joseph has a bit of fun at their expense. By Genesis 47, Jacob, who is now known as Israel, and his sons have moved into Egypt, and Pharaoh gives them choice land in Goshen to settle because of his regard for Joseph. Israel and his children, who come to be known as the Israelites, prosper in that place and multiply. And before his death, Israel blesses each of his sons. These blessings in Genesis 48, where Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and in Genesis 49, where he blesses his own other sons. These are the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel. When Jacob dies, he is buried in the same plot of ground that Abraham had bought for his and Sarah's burial. Now, the stories of Jacob and Joseph are both stories of unlikely people being used to further God's plans. Neither Jacob nor Joseph were the firstborn. Neither would be the expected heir of the promise given the cultural norms of the day. But more than that, not only are they the unexpected person because of their birth order, neither of them really seem to be terribly heroic, terribly wonderful examples of a life of faith at the start. As we said before, Jacob is a liar, a cheat, and a coward. His initial plan is that he'll worship God only if God keeps up God's end of the bargain. But his life is turned around. And Joseph initially seems to be a bit self-centered and arrogant, but God works through him and prospers everything he does. And eventually both Jacob and Joseph will come to understand and have a relationship with the God of their father Abraham. And so, these two unlikely heroes carry on the promise that God made to Abraham. While they still do not own the land they were promised just yet, the descendants of Abraham are absolutely multiplying, and through Joseph, an entire country has been saved by famine. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Forgive my stumbling over Jacob and Joseph a few times here, but next week we'll be looking at what happened to these descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we'll talk about how God calls another unlikely hero, Moses. I'll look forward to joining you again next week for our next Bible Bits. Until then, beloved, may God bless you richly. Amen.